All right, welcome everybody to tonight's presentation. This is MAREA, the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association. Tonight's presentation will be on large-scale solar. Coming up next month will be a nice follow-on. We're going to dive into the residential side of solar, and the topic is solar and green roofs, and this will be related to houses in Philadelphia. Presenting will be Ron Celentano. He will host a virtual tour of four passive house design projects that incorporate solar PV along with green roofs. You've probably seen in any large city, you've seen green roofs, trees and shrubs and up on the roofs. Well, this is done at the residential scale. So the idea is to achieve ultra high energy efficiency, low environmental impact, and ultra low external energy consumption. Ron has been in the solar energy field virtually from the beginning, 50 years. 30 years of that, he's been focused on solar PV. He's president of the Pennsylvania Solar and Storage Industries Association. He's vice president of the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industries, and he's the technical director of the Philadelphia Solar Energy Association. So if there's anybody that knows anything about solar, it's Ron. So join us for that next month. I believe it's October 26th.
28th. October
28th,
28th.
thank you. Yep. So that's a Tuesday.
The last Tuesday, not the
Last Tuesday of
fourth,
the
but the
month.
last.
Yep. And that's our last presentation of the year. So if you're thinking about something you'd like to hear about next year, drop us a note on email. We'd appreciate that. All right. Presenting for tonight, Chuck, you gonna present our speakers?
Yes, it's my pleasure. There's more than one person that knows a lot about solar in Pennsylvania, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce the Penn State Extension Energy Team that's going to be providing us a lot of information about applications and items related to solar installations in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers, and then they will take the stage and proceed to give us a presentation. So Matt Svets is an education program specialist on the Penn State Extension Energy team. Matt's role involves creating educational programs on energy topics for a variety of stakeholders, including community members, organizations, government officials. His role focuses on educating landowners, local government officials, and community members on the utility scale solar, bioenergy, as well as other energy related projects. He has a master's degree in education from the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome, Matt. Joe Coughlin is our second presenter. Before joining Penn State Extension in 2013, Joe was a teacher and he was actively involved in alternative education. Then he left the public sector, got a doctorate in education, and took a position at the Penn State Extension as the district director. He then served as a business operations manager and now is an extension educator working with stakeholders in the nexus of energy development, land use, and policy. And I think Tom's going to be our first speaker, but he's the third that I have listed here. Tom Bresnock is a senior educator with the Penn State Extension Energy team and focuses on science-based education, outreach to community members, organization, and government officials. He works primarily with farmers, landowners, local government officials, and communities regarding utility-scale solar and other energy-related projects. Tom's energy experience includes working with electrical distribution cooperatives, wind energy policy, and several statewide energy organizations. Welcome, all three of you, to MAREA, and we're very much looking forward to learning a lot about solar tonight. So the floor is yours, Tom. Or
Yeah,
Matt?
Chuck, I'll just lead it off for a second here and talk a little bit more about the team before we get into the presentation, but thank you. It's good to be here. So, just a quick statement we need to put up. And yeah, today we will be talking about large-scale solar here in Pennsylvania in the year of 2025. Certainly a lot of developments to cover, but you introduced a few of our team members, but this is our full energy team who are on the ground addressing a variety of energy topics. And if you are interested to learn more about not just solar, but all the other kind of energy topics and learn more about what our team is doing, then feel free to use the QR code, or you can look it up, but you can look up our Penn State Extension Energy Essentials newsletter that will have a variety of articles as well as future events and webinars. So feel free to join us there. And with that, allow me to hand it over to Tom to begin our presentation on large-scale solar.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I guess you're going to run the slide. So we're going to talk about large-scale solar and some other things. So go ahead and bring up the first slide. Okay, this is my favorite slide. I almost always say this every presentation. If you remember one slide in this whole slide deck, this is the one I think really ties a lot of things together. So I asked a question of a friend of mine over at Allegheny Energy, and I didn't really expect an answer. The question was, what's the future of energy in Pennsylvania? And he didn't skip a beat. He's like, oh, it's in the energy triangle. And I'm like, well, what's the energy triangle? And basically, the energy triangle is price, policy, and technology. And as those three things change and move, that's where we primarily see the concentration of where we get our energy from. And solar is a great example of this because you have seen the technology get better and better and better in the last 25, 30 years, exponential jumps in the technology of the panels, the efficiency of the panels. You saw the price plummet over the last few decades in the panels, and you had a lot of incentive from the policy side for a number of years with tax incentives and other things to really propel the technology. So solar is a great example of the energy triangle. The other big energy source in PA would be natural gas, and that also saw a lot of technology come in from the Marcellus drilling capability, and that plummeted the price of natural gas. And now we're seeing some favorable policy shifts in that direction. So just keep that in mind when you think about energy in general. I love the concept in the slide, so I always start out with that one. Next slide. A snapshot of Pennsylvania energy production. We always try to highlight kind of where we sit. We're right behind Texas. Texas is definitely a powerhouse in actual energy production, but we're second in the U.S. Most of our electric generation source is currently natural gas fired. Nuclear is actually second. A lot of people maybe don't know that. We have quite a bit of nuclear here in the Commonwealth. And then in third place, coal is still in third place. And then you get into some hydroelectric and then the renewable section of that. But just keep in mind, we're a big powerhouse here in Pennsylvania on energy. We export about 25% of what we produce. Next slide. Here's a quick snapshot of where we source our electric generation. And when I talked about the energy triangle, here it is in action. So if you went back not many years, I mean, if you're looking around 2014, 2015, coal in this state was producing most of the electricity in Pennsylvania. And then there's the crossover around 2015, where they unlock the Marcellus gas, and you see natural gas plummet in price, and then it takes over in dominating the electric production in Pennsylvania. Nuclear is very steady state. So once those reactors are online, you're talking 40 to 80 years of use out of those reactors. But that's a very stable source of power for PA, has been for quite some time. But this really highlights the crossover between coal and natural gas. And you see the renewables have been somewhat steady with some uptick lately in the last couple of years. Next slide. I always kind of try to point this out. It's not all apples to apples when we talk about energy sources. So I always try to make sure people understand capacity factor. So capacity factor really is a snapshot of the actual generation compared to the maximum amount over a given period of time. So when we think of nuclear, once it comes online, it's pretty much a 24/7, 365 power source. There is some downtime for refueling and maintenance on a nuclear plant, but it's extraordinarily a high capacity factor. Geothermal is actually very high at 65%. Natural gas is around 60. And while you get into the renewables, they're the most affordable, but because of the intermittence, they have a much lower capacity factor. National average for solar is around 23, 24%. In Pennsylvania, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 14% here. We're not the perfect place for solar, but it does work really well. Next slide. A couple terms here that you're going to hear on and off. When we talk about the scales of solar, I know you're going to have a talk a little bit later about some residential things going on here in the state. So residential units would be in that smaller, 10 kilowatt, maybe 100 some kilowatt. It's not a large amount of power generation for a home. A lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is on the other end of the scale there. You see the grid scale. So we kind of define that when we're talking about 20 megs or more. So some pretty large scale production in a grid scale solar. But we will touch on later in the presentation something called net metering or merchant generator, and that's a sweet spot. It's an unusual thing here in Pennsylvania. It's around a 3 megawatt installation. Yeah, the term community solar is talked about quite a bit. Pennsylvania currently does not allow community solar, although there are quite a few different pending legislation bills out there to kind of address that. Next slide. I also like to take a second to run through how electricity gets to us. And, we all take it for granted. You switch the light switch on and, power comes on, you turn your television on, it works, you turn your computer on. But really it is a very sophisticated and expensive network. So you have some sort of generation. It could be solar or wind or nuclear. So the power is generated somewhere. It's usually being generated somewhere farther from the population source. So there's a step-up transformer involved to push that voltage up to go across those really large transmission lines you see when you're driving maybe on the turnpike or something. You see some of those really tall transmission lines. They in turn come into a region where there's a population, and there'll be a transmission substation of equipment to start lowering that voltage. It'll further get dropped down into a distribution substation, so it's getting much closer to homes or businesses. And then you see the individual lines and maybe a pad-mounted transformer. Maybe you have one on a pole. But this snapshot of what you're looking at, just so you understand, a lot of the increase in the electric bill that you're receiving is on this generation transmission part of this. And I would just say currently those large transmission lines, that infrastructure to get it from A to B in some parts of the country, it's probably touching $5 to $6 million per mile. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about energy or talking about the cost drivers of electricity. This is a big part of that. And I think you're going to hear more and more about this in the news in the years to come. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of Pennsylvania's annual solar installations and the capacity. And you can see, again, I'm going to go back to the energy triangle. In 2020, you have some words coming on with the Inflation Reduction Act, some policy incentives really help propel a lot of this. So you see grid scale and PA really start to skyrocket on the scale. You're seeing a lot of this intermediate kind of installation where we're going to talk about merchant generation, but you do see a large leap in installed capacity here in the Commonwealth in just the last few years. Next slide. Here's just a quick snapshot of something we're pretty proud of. We developed a municipal guide to solar a couple years ago. So we were getting tons of questions at the municipal level, at the local level, because in Pennsylvania, there are really few statewide regulations on this. So the townships really have a lot of say in what can or cannot be deployed in your area. And so if you want to use the QR code here to go to this guide, it's a pretty in-depth guide. It goes through a lot of terms and terminology that you may not be familiar with, but it's a great resource, especially if you have some friends that are in local government. Next slide. And a couple reasons why are we seeing the growth? Some simple reasons. There's definitely enough sun here in PA. I did mention it's not the perfect place for solar, but the efficiency of the panels and the costs make it a great option for a lot of people. A large amount of infrastructure exists. So I mentioned before we export about 25% of our power. We really do have a lot of transmission throughout the state. It is aging, and there's going to be a lot of cost involved in upgrades, but there's a lot of infrastructure that does exist. We saw a lot of policy change from the Inflation Reduction Act, and even in the state of Pennsylvania, we had a lot of incentives for solar in the last 10 years or so. And then business and government development, because there's a lot of investor support for renewables or carbon-free energy. And then again, we touched on this before, and I think some of the other presenters will talk about parts of the Inflation Reduction Act helping to decline costs. So next slide. A real quick snapshot. We talked about some of the investment tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. Just so you know, Pennsylvania was actually eligible for a lot of kind of bonus content because you had the base 30% that came back with the Inflation Reduction Act, but there were a lot of other additional incentives, especially if they were in low income areas or former coal mine areas. There was some domestic bonus credit if the units were produced here. So you could really add these credits on and probably get upwards of almost 50-60% of a tax credit. So there were some enormous incentives out there. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the rollback of that's coming. But just a snapshot of some of the parts of the state that were really well positioned to take advantage of that. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what's driving electric demand and why you're seeing a lot of cost increases, especially if you've looked at your bill probably since 2019. You've seen it. If you haven't looked at your bill, maybe that's a good thing, but I guarantee you've seen the increases. Next slide. Okay, this is a little bit of a terminology about the PJM. So that's a regional transmission organization that Pennsylvania is part of, along with 12 other states. Their job really is to keep the lights on every day and make sure there's enough power in that regional transmission organization grid to do all the things we want to do every day. And when you hear about in the news the auction price increases or the capacity price increases, it's really a supply and demand driver. It's a red flag for generation. They are very concerned about limits of generation, and there's a lot of concern about legacy power systems being taken offline before there's really a viable replacement. So that's a big driver in this and something that's been in the news quite a bit. Next slide. Another snapshot of the capacity auction. It's also called the base residual auction. Really, they're looking at the needs down the road. So they're looking at 26, 27 delivery year when they were doing this. But when you hear this in the news, just so you understand, the percent component of this auction price is probably around 8% of your electric bill. It's not driving absolutely everything. The cost of purchasing the power is by far the most, and then transmission, all that equipment I was showing to get the power from A to B is an enormous component of the cost of electric to residents and businesses. Next slide. And so where are we seeing the rapid growth? So that green shading on the US, that's what I was talking about. That's the PJM region. That's the RTO we belong to. And you can see the forecast from 2024 to 2026. That is a huge jump. We have seen probably in the last 20 years a very steady state or decrease in electric demand. A lot of that came about from efficiency increases. People switched to LED lighting. They switched to a lot of things that are much more efficient in the last decade or so. So we were seeing pretty level demand, and now there were some major predictions for growth ERCOT is Texas is on its own grid. They're really expecting enormous up to 25% demand increase. Next slide. And then, what's driving this? Really, there's a skyrocketing use for commercial computing. And so these are some projections coming between 2020 and 2050. And you can see that the consumption in the US commercial sector is going to have an enormous ramp up in computing. And artificial intelligence and those data centers are the big driver for this expected demand increase. But it's a pretty shocking amount of power that's going to be needed to supply what's needed for these AI centers. Next slide. A couple of other things that are driving this. It's not entirely data centers, but I talked about our regional transmission organization. It's listed there, the PJM. These are some other areas of the country. They're being driven by other things, including increased electrification for cars and homes. New York has a lot of proposals for that. And then you've seen a bigger increase in electric demands for industry. A lot of industries are using a lot more electrical power for what they produce. So those are other drivers, but the big driver really is the data centers, and they're spread across a number of regions in the country. Next slide. Here's a snapshot. I just left this in here because it's a nice visual of where the main hub for the internet actually began. So it's in Northern Virginia was kind of where it all began, and then the other main hub is Silicon Valley. So since it was kind of developed, there are clusters of people that work there and are experts there, and that really drives the data center explosion in Northern Virginia. I think these are 17 or 18 proposed. This is from a 2024 New York Times article. I think they've actually tried to put a cap on it because it's just been explosive growth there. And it is stressing our regional transmission grid with the amount of proposed and existing data centers that are coming online. But Virginia is really an epicenter of this. We're not far from there, so we become very attractive as they look for places to expand, but yet stay quite close to the population centers and Northern Virginia. Next slide. I think this is my last slide, but I always kind of like to put an idea, a visual in people's mind. When we talk about this grid adding the power needed for these data centers, it would be kind of the equivalent of dropping another New York City magically somewhere in maybe in the middle of Pennsylvania. Could you imagine another New York City appears and you need to power that? So just keep that in mind. That's one of the estimates for what we're going to need in electric demand just through 2030. And with that, I think I'm going to transition to Dr. Conklin.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I'm gonna go into a little bit on what the difference and what is going on with utility scale and net metering. I think a lot of people out there don't realize that there is a difference, and when they're looking at an array that is a few dozen acres versus a couple hundred acres, what that actually means here, especially in the state of Pennsylvania. I was listening in earlier before we got on, and I think it was Chuck or one of the other leaders of the group that was here earlier said that a lot of the people here are from Pennsylvania and southeastern Pennsylvania. So, this is really going to be Pennsylvania centric. And if you are from southeastern Pennsylvania and you catch the news at all, I'm sure you've heard of PJM. If you could switch the slide, Matthew. Yeah, so the governor here recently held a meeting in Philadelphia with a number of other governors, kind of laying out some of their issues with PJM and what they thought they might be able to do about that. So what is PJM? PJM is a regional transmission organization. It's the largest one in the country, I believe 65 million customers, 13 states, including the District of Columbia. So it could be 12 states and the District of Columbia. Either way, it's there on the map. And they kind of cheat a little bit because they say Tennessee, but it's legit like half a county. but that counts as a state if you look at the map there. So, but it is the largest in the country. Next slide, please. So what is the status of PJM? It was inundated with thousands of projects. And most of those projects were renewable in terms of solar, wind, and battery storage. That inundation led to a backup of the queue. They have a queue system. In the federal government, under FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did intervene and long story short said, you need to fix your queue. You need to come up with a better system. So PJM has been in the process over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years, working through that queue and streamlining some things. What that has allowed time for is for them to verify projects that are in the queue. And also, there was a moratorium in, I believe, March of 2023, in which they weren't accepting any new projects into the queue. So while they have been doing this, projects, of course, have been delayed to allow for the interconnection study because their main role is to ensure not only the feasibility of the projects, but to ensure the stability of the grid. They they are energy agnostic in the sense of they're just looking for megawatts. They don't necessarily care where those megawatts come from. All right. So what that has created here in Pennsylvania is an opportunity for projects at the distribution level. We have an opportunity here in Pennsylvania. It came from what we call the Homrich case. Some people call it the Homrich loophole, which allows for projects from a half a megawatt up to 3 megawatts to net meter at a retail rate as opposed to a wholesale rate. So I'll get into that a little bit more, but a retail rate for just bar napkin math is twice the amount of wholesale rate. So you can see how you would work out your math there. Next slide, please. So generation interconnection by fuel type, depending on your monitor, the pink and the greens there, that's all that solar storage and wind. What the queue had been built on for decades was what was above that. So your natural gas, your coal for the most part. So they were dealing with, I'm not even going to say hundreds of projects, dozens of projects per year. And now suddenly they're dealing with thousands of projects here. So if you're in a business or, in your personal life, if suddenly you're dealing with 10, 15, 20 more times of something, there's an issue, whatever that something is, correct? So that's what PGM was faced with. Next slide, please. So they did come up with a plan. I know you really can't see this because I know I can't really see it on my screen unless I'm on the big screen here. But they did come up with a timeline, and that timeline took all those projects, and depending when those projects came in, they now have to make decisions. So they'll have a decision point 1, decision point 2, decision point 3. I think all they get is 3. And at each decision point, they have to not only decide whether they're going to move forward, but they have to show validation of their project. They have to show site control. And that's generally in the way of a lease that they have secured site control. At the next decision point, they have to, depending on the size of the project, pony up some money. I believe I want to say it's $1 or $5,000 per megawatt. So if it's a 20 megawatt project, they would have to pony up $100,000 to move that project forward to allow for that feasibility study. Because these feasibility studies are, teams of engineers looking at these projects. It's not cheap. So that's what they came up with, and what we're going to see here is the result. Next slide, please. So this is from Pennsylvania DEP, and you can see how that bell curve, we're going to see a bell curve going on here. And so when I started tracking this all about 3 years ago, I was finding it was upwards of almost 1,000 projects in the PJM queue. It's not necessarily reflected in the DEP data here, but this is illustrative. So I found 1,000 or so projects. Some of them were repeats. Some of them were projects where they were trying to see which substation they could go to make it less expensive for upgrades and things of that nature. As time has gone on, and we can see here in April 23, October 23, we can see the dip, right? It starts to go down. And that's really when a lot of those decision points started taking place in PJM. So what I believe was happening is what we called Q squatting, in which Tom and Joe could come up with Tom and Joe Solar LLC, and we could throw a bunch of projects on the queue to see what the cost was to move them forward. And either we may decide to move forward with one project, or we might even decide to sell that queue spot to a legitimate developer. That was 100% occurring in PJM at the time. So as those tariffs become real, those decision points become real, you do see a drop in the amount of projects that are being putting forth. I will put this out there. This is all happening before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that occurred earlier this summer that doesn't go in effect for another couple of months. That dip occurred before that act goes into place. Next slide, please. So here is the map. If you go into the PGA system map, and here's the chart. Tom had mentioned these utility scale projects, they are going to be sited along utility lines. So all these, green, red, orange lines on here are utility lines of different kilovolts. And you'll see those little sunshines, those are all just solar arrays. The little batteries are just storage. And the blue and black things, that's a combo of storage and solar. So these large projects are all being located along those lines, to Tom's point, of $4-6 million per mile for transmission. Now, since I've been tracking this in the last 3 years, over here on the right, at one point in time, the amount of solar and storage that was in the queue was 26,000 megawatts. As of right now, that is at 12,000 megawatts. I should say as of a month ago, it's 12,000 megawatts. That's when I pulled this data. So we have seen some of those projects leave the queue. Next slide, please. So this has presented an opportunity for two reasons. One, the queue is slow. Two, the Harmridge case and allowing for retail rate as opposed to wholesale rate. So what the Harmridge case has allowed for is net metering projects up to 3 megawatts. So a half megawatt to 3 megawatts. There are exceptions to the rule for 5 megawatts if there's a large industrial. If you put it out behind a large factory and it's eating up 2 megawatts, then you can put 5 megawatts as long as the factory's taking 2. We don't need to get lost in that. But projects are not required to have an on-site load. In other words, you don't have to have a factory there. You don't have to have a barn there. All they really have is lights there to illuminate the area for safety. So there's no parasitic load required. Projects can be adjacent to one another with separate meters. So what we are seeing and why it's becoming this loophole is a project might be located on one side of the road, and then a project could be located on the other side of the road, or even on the same side of the road, 100 yards down, and it's all separately fenced off with a different meter, right? We have seen a substantial increase in merchant requests that have gone through the Public Utility Commission. I'll show that in the next slide here. Again, those are reviewed by the PUC and the local utility. That interconnection request happens at the EDC. That's your PPL, your First Energy, your Duquesne Light. They're really the ones who are approving that, and then PUC is simply filing that paperwork for the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard Act. They're not really approving anything. They're tabulating. Next slide, please. So here's what we've seen. The graph on the left is the amount of projects. The graph on the right is it's in kilowatts per year, and it's not complete data in that 2020 from 2020 to 2024, I have complete data because of end of year. 2025 is up until August. So what we see is with that Harmich case in 22, 23, we see the developers start to figure this out. In 2024, it really explodes. So they see that as the capital follows the path of least resistance, right? So they see that as the pathway. So we expect in 2025 those numbers to match 2024. What this graph is on the right is the amount of kilowatts. What it turns out to be is about 2.5 megawatts per project. Next slide, please. All right, one big beautiful bill in the state. Next slide, please. All right, so unless you've been living under a rock lately, and I believe this group has not, you've all heard of the One Big Beautiful Act, HR 1, signed on the 4th of July. It impacts many facets of American life, including solar energy projects. Tax credits did exist before the IRA. They've existed for almost 2 decades. They were phased to go out. I believe it was 26% before the IRA. Then it jumped up, as Tom had said, to 30%. And depending on sourcing materials, depending on who you were using for labor, depending where you were putting, it could get up to 50, 60, I think even 70% of a tax credit. Next slide, please. What happens with HR 1 is it ends 45Y, the production tax credit, and 48E, the investment tax credit. 45Y is really more or less for wind. That's mostly wind companies use that. 45E was what we were seeing from the solar companies, and that's the initial investment, what they have to put up front, right? For solar projects. So HR 1 ends that for solar projects not in service before December 31st, 2027. There is a safe harbor provision, though, that if they do start construction before July 5th of 2026, they're exempt from this termination date. Let me put it this way. They were not already in that PJM queue in PJM. They likely will not get that project near off the ground or even qualify for safe harbor if they weren't already in that queue. And last but not least, I know we're talking solar and all facets, but 25D is the residential clean energy credit. So that's what's going to go on your home. And that does end on December 31st, 2025 at 30%. Next slide, please. I think my next two slides, oh, well, okay, I forgot about this. What I think is actually probably going to be more important than those deadlines is the foreign entity restrictions. HR 1 adds a foreign entity of concern rules for solar projects here in the United States. If projects starting after December 31st, 2025 must prove components are not from a prohibited foreign entity. We don't have to read through the lines for that. We know that means China, right? So they have to prove that those components did not come from China after December 31st, 2025 for that calculation. At least 40% of the manufactured products not from a PFE starting in 2026, then increasing, I think it's 40 this year or 2026, and I think 45 in 2027, 50 in 20 until it reaches 60% by 2030. Next slide, please. All right, so the lightning plan here in Pennsylvania, Governor Shapiro at the beginning of the year put forth the lightning plan. It has 6 or 7 points. I'm only going to touch on 3. One is a reset he put forth, and that legislation has made it through the House. I believe it's sitting in a Senate committee for the Reliable Energy Siting and Electric Transition Board. That would only apply to projects 25 megawatts or more. Which if you look at the data, out of the 1,000 projects in PJM, it would probably only apply to about 10% of those. So all those net metering and the other 900 projects in PJM, this wouldn't even touch. PRESS, the Pennsylvania Reliable Energy Sustainability Standard, increases the tier 1 from 18% to 35%. That no doubt would increase that solar carve out. We currently have a 0.5% solar carve out here in Pennsylvania. That would just naturally have to go up, right? And the Community Energy Act, House Bill 504, I know there's some interest here with that group. That has passed the House. It's in the Senate, I believe, Consumer Affairs Protection or something like that committee right now. And that the the niche, the linchpin there is they have been putting forth community solar for years and was getting nowhere. So they added things like geothermal and digesters to that. So what it spills out, I read the 18-page bill today. It allows for operating the power centers and for the power centers to bill the subscribers, and it also requires that the EDCs accept the interconnections. And the linchpin in all of this is Reggie. The Senate has said they are not necessarily willing to deal on any of the governor's energy proposals until the state Supreme Court decides what is going on with a regional greenhouse gas initiative. Next slide, please. And I am running out of time completely. So there's three other legislative themes out there: decommissioning, and that's what happens with all the solar panels after the solar panels are done. And that is generally regulated either through the lease or through the local municipalities. We're trying to get state oversight on that. The next one is net metering. There are some concerns coming out from legislators and PUC on allowing for that retail rate. And the last one is data centers, of course, which is going to be a whole other webinar in December. You would like to register for that, for the Penn State Extension webinar on data centers, and we'll talk all about that. Tom, what is the date of that webinar, sir?
You think I'd remember?
Well, if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get the update. All right, I am done, Mr. Matt. Your turn.
All right. Thank you, Joe. So, I'll be talking about some siting and zoning considerations for solar to round this out. So, generally, what does the land use impact look like for large-scale solar? Well, generally speaking, we see that solar array takes up about 5 to 8 acres per megawatt. So when we're looking at a utility scale solar system, that will generally be at least 100 acres. When we look at a net metering system, those are usually a little bit more on the high end of that acres per megawatt, but I'd say generally speaking, we see about 35 acres as the maximum there. And what would community solar look like? Well, as we said before, community solar hasn't really been legislatively defined, so what that maximum could be would be dependent on the legislation. In other areas, we see something like 10 megawatts, but for PA, we don't know yet how large those systems can get. And finally, one interesting thing we've seen with these smaller projects on the net metering side is that because they're kind of limited in their size, when we look at land impacts, landowners in PA who have a large amount of land, whether that be just general landowners or farmers, are getting some level of choice in how they have these deployed on their land. Obviously, there's other restrictions, but they can generally work with the developer to potentially site these systems on more marginal land that might not be as good for crop production. So that's just an interesting thing I want to point out. Also, when we think of large-scale solar and how it looks, oftentimes people might think of it as just panels on panels lined up one row to the next in one field, just straight line. But here's an example of something that's a little bit more distributed. So this is a 156 megawatt project, the Shorebird Solar project by Lightsource BP. But as you can see here, those 156 megawatts are actually fairly spread out across 2 counties and 4 townships in separate chunks. And this is kind of another way that this large scale solar can look like, where it's technically one project, but it's also fairly distributed. Also, how these net metering projects might look, well, we did talk about kind of the megawatt limitations and therefore the land limitations, but you can also see that as long as these projects can be separately metered, so one project gets one metered and is considered its own project, and the other project can get its own meter, then as you can see here, these can technically be sited right next to each other or close by, and technically be considered two separate projects, therefore kind of getting somewhat around that land limitation. So, what are developers looking for when they actually decide to develop these projects? Well, as Tom mentioned, the number one priority here, the thing that can make or break a project, are these transmission costs. So it's not only kind of distance from these transmission lines, as you saw on the map, all of those projects were pretty much on the transmission lines you saw there, but it's also if the transmission lines themselves have adequate capacity. So you can only really load so much electricity onto a line before you have to significantly upgrade the equipment, upgrade the line. So it's both distance, which for utility scale projects is generally about 3 miles, around 3 miles that most projects can feasibly work. But it's also do those transmission lines, does the substation have that capacity, or are the upgrades to allow it to have that capacity just out of reach of the developer? When we look at net metering, those are on the three-phase power lines that are a step down from the high voltage transmission that generally deliver power to larger operations such as farms or businesses. When we look at those, generally speaking, about half a mile to a mile is where these projects can kind of be economically feasible, as well as just having that capacity. So other considerations, so we often hear as, we work a lot with rural communities. We often hear this kind of complaint. Well, why do solar developers site on agricultural lands? Well, it's kind of the same reason why a lot of different types of development site on agricultural lands, whether that be housing or warehouses, and that's because it's flat, relatively flat. It has kind of the land that you need to actually build these larger projects. It's relatively well drained, so it makes construction a lot easier. Now, we have seen some upgrades and tracking systems for solar that allow them to track the sun that can work more effectively on more uneven terrain or just advancements in how they actually drive solar systems into the ground that can help, but generally speaking, it's easier on this flatter land. We do also see, some desire to site these projects on brownfields or even Superfund sites. Well, that can work in certain circumstances. It often is always going to depend on the site. So there's some sites that are relatively less contaminated that can be cleaned up fairly quickly and efficiently, where that can work, but there's also sites where that cleanup can add a significant amount of costs just from the time it takes and, the borrowed capital that's incurring interest that can really make it economically infeasible. And there's also, you think it's a win-win for the developer and the community, but there's also sometimes we've seen with some developers who've tried this, some community pushback on the idea that their construction on the site might increase runoff, which it's a possibility if it isn't accounted for, but certainly can be accounted for and protected if done correctly. So, and then finally, when we look at, where do developers actually want to build, a lot of developers we talk to, generally are interested in working with municipalities that already have some sort of zoning ordinance or solar ordinance in place that allows them to kind of understand the process, already have guidelines in order to meet, and they're willing to jump through those hoops to have that added level of certainty. Especially earlier on, we've seen a lot of townships not have these ordinances in place. The developer comes in and they try to work with each other. Developer kind of waits and tries to help them through the process of developing a zoning ordinance, but it always causes more tension and miscommunications when they're kind of in the middle of trying to do that process, and it takes just so much more time as well. So, generally speaking, a lot of developers are interested in working with municipalities with these kind of ordinances already in place. And to give you a better idea of, I talked about these certain factors, but the Center for Rural PA kind of took into the account these factors as well as land prices, potential for incentives and the like, and mapped out potential hotspots for solar development here in PA. Now, as you can see here, a lot of different hotspots where it makes a lot of sense, but also the brighter the colors, the more it works. So as you can see here, there's still a lot more places in PA that it can work, but generally speaking, you see up in the Northwest, a bit more Southeast Central, Southwest Central, and kind of a few places in the center of PA where it generally is more favorable. And also, one thing I want to talk about when we're talking about, so that was for utility scale, just to make that clear. When we talk about net metering, there's one thing I think we need to account for, and that's only utilities are required to give net metering that retail rate to these net metering solar sites, merchant generators. So we also in PA, as Tom is a member of rural electric cooperatives that aren't under these regulations to accept net metering projects. Now, as you can see here, this is a map of where the territories these generally service, but I want to make it clear that these lines are not solid. Utilities work within these areas too. It's just a matter of where you are specifically in these areas, whether you're serviced by a utility or by a rural electric cooperative. So, generally speaking, you could see a net metering project because three-phase power is ubiquitous in PA. But if the area in question is serviced by a rural electric cooperative, then a net metering project really isn't going to happen there. So let's get more into kind of what we see as far as how the community looks at this large-scale solar issue. So this was data collected by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. And this kind of looked at what were developers seeing as kind of the biggest concerns when they went out into communities and kind of tried to get projects through. So the biggest one, number one, we saw here was the concerns about visual impact. So this idea of, it's not fitting in with the rural aesthetic. People next to them don't really want to see that compared to just a field. And that kind of also plays into another part where we see this concern about loss of ag land when it comes to solar and how, generally speaking, a lot of it is being directed towards agricultural land. We also see a few other things such as local environmental concerns of taking up that land, how it might affect different wildlife, as well as sound, effects on property values for those next to it. But these are generally the concerns. And also to make it clear, the yellow there is solar and the blue there is wind when we're looking at the bars. Now, one thing to talk about, just to put it into perspective when we talk about loss of ag land, is that the DEP made estimates about how much land would be required for about 10% of our energy demands to be met by solar, and it's about 80,000 acres to meet that demand. And to give you a frame of reference here, this is active farmland. You have about 95K of golf courses, So it is important to keep that in perspective when we talk about the actual impacts there. And then really when we talk about, how communities interact with a potential solar development project, well, the majority of it is through zoning in Pennsylvania. So there are other federal regulations on solar, but they're very sparse, just mainly National Electric Code, fire codes. But generally speaking, and also NPDES permits by DEP to prevent potential runoff. But generally speaking, townships are the main regulators of solar here in PA. So that's mainly on the municipal level, and there's, some 25, 26,000 municipalities here in PA. And they're generally given the zoning authority. Now, if they don't have any kind of zoning regulations, they can opt into the county sharing a zoning regulation between multiple townships that don't want to enforce their own. I think Monterey County has that system of having a county-wide zoning ordinance for the municipalities that don't want to do their own. But generally speaking, it's going to be on the municipal level. And what we see here is so you're permitted by right an accessory use that generally is given to residential systems or accessory uses. And then generally speaking, for our large scale, we see our special exception and conditional use. So permitted by right, you submit the necessary building permits and other required documents that they have. And generally speaking, as long as everything comes up clear, you're given the right to build. Now, your special exception conditional use is a little bit different. That is generally you go through the Planning Commission, which is a board of citizens who give some recommendations on your project. The Zoning Hearing Board for special exception, or the Board of Supervisors for conditional use can, kind of work off those recommendations. The developer might take the recommendations of the Planning Commission and revise their project, then come back, the Zoning Hearing Board or the Board of Supervisors who actually have the authority to enforce the conditions. The Planning Commission is more of a recommendation, but they will put on certain conditions that the developer must meet to be approved, or they can also deny the project, which in that case, the developer either gives up or can appeal it in the Court of Common Pleas, take it all the way up to the state Supreme Court. But generally speaking, that's kind of how it works. If they do get approved, then it's just a matter of meeting other permitting requirements. To touch on residential solar, but there's only so much time. Generally speaking, same as large scale solar, regulated mainly on the national level by a uniform construction code, which includes national electric codes and also fire codes from the National Fire Protection Agency. But generally speaking, just to make sure that the construction is safe, not a fire hazard, that electricity is safe, electrical wiring is safe. So, and then I think the biggest thing we see on the residential side is how do we define this principal use, which is generally for larger scale systems that are just meant to produce electricity. So your net metering and grid scale solar, and accessory use, which is reserved for just a residential system or potentially a commercial system. So that this discussion can get, how do you make that difference? So sometimes there's a kilowatt capacity, say no more than 15 kilowatts, otherwise it's principal use and has to go through conditional and special exception requirements. I think this works more when there's an exception for rooftop, because when we're talking about zoning, not regulating, if it doesn't have an effect on the actual land, then how much are you really interested in preventing it from being large if they have the roof space? There's also people usually go for maybe a percentage of electricity must be used on site, say no more than 110%, which again might not factor in for how much roof space the um, person of interest might have, so they might be able to get more than that. I'd also see people set it a little bit more at like 150%. And then we also see maybe a little bit more vague language as the electricity produced is primarily used on site. So maybe that means 50%, maybe that means 51% of the electricity used is used on site. But other than that, really, for especially rooftop, other than eliminating overhang or height requirements, we don't see too much in most regulations. And then ground mounted, you might see some setback regulations. You might see them require it to be in the side or backyard. But yeah. And then when we're talking about more large scale solar, really with setbacks, that is just an offset from the property line, public roadways, other properties that they need. Generally speaking, we either see that zoning ordinances will have it set to the same as any other type of development in the area that they have, or they might make a difference, especially some townships. Generally speaking, if they do decide to differentiate it from other uses, they'll do so by setting it back, I'd say 100 to 300 feet is generally what we see. We definitely have seen some townships go 500 to 1,000, but that's the average. Or they've also might generally set setbacks at a certain level, and then if it's next to a residential property, they might make an extra amount of distance required. Screening, which is generally just an attempt to kind of blend the solar site more in with the local environment by using shrubbery, trees, and the like, or fencing, and that is usually either a prescriptive approach, so ordinances will say you need a tree every 6 feet and then a shrub every 3 feet, or it's a more performance approach where they're just saying, okay, the developer will do their best to make it so that the solar site is reasonably blended in and hidden from the environment. Oftentimes in the conditional use process, the planning committee or the township board of supervisors can take community feedback and kind of change these requirements. And then also townships might give the zoning officer leeway to kind of determine, say, if one side of the solar site is just facing woods, then does it really need to be screened? So there are options and some flexibility that can be given. Glint and glare, solar panels generally are designed to absorb light, not reflect it. You might have some issues when the sun is settling down in the evening or rising in the morning. But oftentimes when developers do glare studies, they don't really find any kind of real significant glare. But if they do, generally speaking, they would just adjust the angle of the panels in question in order to relieve that. So generally speaking, we see for these larger scale projects, the municipalities will require developers to do a glare analysis. Stormwater management. So generally for large scale projects, anything over 1 acre, which would be pretty much everyone, would be required to submit an erosion and sediment control plan as well as a national pollution discharge permit for, storm to account for stormwater. Now, Penn State has done a lot of work on this. We did a study on some pretty unfavorable sites we have here in Penn State. And generally speaking, as long as you put proper stormwater controls, which there's been a lot of progress in research and making and best practices for solar sites in order to mitigate any potential stormwater runoff that has happened in the earlier days when we didn't quite have that experience. But generally speaking, it's more than manageable as long as best practices are used. And finally, fire safety here. When we talk about fire safety, the panels themselves, the electrical equipment, isn't flammable. They really aren't a concern to burn up. I mean, most of a panel is aluminum and glass. So the real challenge is that at the end of the day, it's an electrical power plant. There are high voltages, and firefighters don't need special equipment. They really just need specialized training, and for most the part, when townships kind of do include this in their ordinances, they generally require that an emergency plan is set up in case of a fire that can be shared with the local fire department, and that they have somebody on staff that can answer any questions. And generally speaking, national electric codes include some requirements to make it easier to depower the system as best as possible to help out with that process. But generally speaking, since the equipment itself isn't really flammable, from what I've heard from some townships, is just the plan is, the grass might burn, but control it, keep it contained, and then let it kind of burn out, and, just put out where it might get out of control outside the site itself. But with that, I think I'm finished on my part, and I think we can take questions now.
Thank you
Thank
very
you very
much.
much. Lots and lots of information there. Chuck, do you want to pick up the questions?
Sure, I have to find them first. Just give me a second.
I'll snag the first one, Chuck, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
What will happen with SREC pricing in the coming years?
Do you want me to take that one, Matt?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so SREC pricing. The answer is that depends. And a lot of that is going to depend on the current legislation under the Governor's Lightning Plan press. I actually quoted a wrong number in my talk. Right now, Tier 1 is at 8%. What the governor's plan is to have that up to, I think, 35% by 2030. So what you would see is an increase in demand for solar energy under that Tier 1. My daughter just waved at me, sorry. Under that Tier 1 pricing, she totally distracted me. Under that Tier 1 pricing scheme, not scheme, but so, if it goes from 0.5 to 3% or 4% or 5%, that would increase the demand, right? So right now we're 100% meeting that demand, that we're meeting what we need to meet at 0.5. We're actually at like 1.5%. If we go over that, that's where that appetite will come from, and that SREC price will increase. Sorry about that. She's got done brushing her teeth.
Okay. So what can you provide an estimate of the current breakdown by county? Is it
Country.
country? Current breakdown by country of components purchased. How much is currently purchased from China? And if not purchased from China, can the U.S. market adequately backfill the demand that's required?
Yeah, I don't know, Spence, if you want to take it, but I would take a stab. I think that's that's a tough question, because I think you're looking at initially the parts of the panel, the wafers, the individual components were like 95% China, and then a lot of production switched to Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Cambodia, some of those countries, and then we saw growth of module assembly in the US that was kind of propelled by Inflation Reduction Act. So I think it gets a little tricky on, you know, uh, kind of exactly where it's quote unquote U.S. produced or not or assembled. Now the incentives were there in the Inflation Reduction Act as they're kind of scaled back. I don't know without that incentive if you'll see uh, those U.S. companies stand up more. It's all to be determined. I think if we knew the answer, we'd be doing really well in the stock market right now if we knew for sure what was going to happen there. I don't know, Matt, if you want to add to that on the component
Yeah,
side.
and I get the concern with the FEOC that requires you know puts restrictions on accessing tax credits with um if a company's I think the ownership is largely Chinese owned, I think is the big one, but any foreign entity of concern listed. But generally speaking, I think, yeah. I mean, there are bigger players here in the US that are relatively US produced. I think First Solar would be the biggest example. Can they meet like US produced panel requirements on their own with their current production? Not really. We're still seeing we have definitely seen a lot of imports from especially Southeast Asia. But yeah, First Solar is at least a significant company when it comes to p panel production that we've seen.
Okay. How about agrivoltaics? Are there any projects in Pennsylvania on agrivoltaics?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of our partners, we bring on a lot of the programs. Daniel Daughter, he focuses on sheep, basically bringing sheep in to trim down the grass under the panels to keep it kind of mowed with the sheep. I think he's actually had a hard time getting enough sheep to do it, honestly. I think that he has a little bit of issue with maybe transportation, getting from A to B, but he's really gung ho about that. I know there's been a lot of research in what maybe could grow under the panels. Some of our agronomy teams looked at that. I know Cornell and some of the other extensions are also looking at that. But yeah, it's a unique idea. I guess it just depends on the landowner because normally if you want to do something like space the panels out so that you could maybe produce something in between there or under there, you may actually get a little bit lower of a payout. There may be some cost increase for that. We talked with a group that was looking to actually raise the panels up pretty high so that you could actually rotate beef or dairy between the panels. So a lot of great ideas around agrivoltaics, but it's a cost factor and a benefit to the landowner that kind of comes in, into the equation there. But there's a lot going on, and currently it seems like sheep within the panels is seeing the most attraction here in PA. But I don't know, Matt, if you want to comment on some of that.
I'll,
No, I think. Oh, go ahead,
I'll
Joe.
make a comment. So, agrivoltaics, it's a great idea. It's a great selling point when you're trying to sell a development to a township that might not want uh, to lose their ag land. But in Pennsylvania, at least, there isn't necessarily an incentive beyond that to do agrivoltaics. You go to Massachusetts, there is an incentive. So the state there actually requires and then gives a financial incentive for the developer to use agrivoltaics in these types of projects. We actually, for our energy and ag conference, we have Blue Wave, who is a developer in Massachusetts, coming to talk about that. I was talking with him the other day, with one of the guys the other day, and he said, "Well, why isn't that a big deal here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?" I said, "Well, unlike Massachusetts, the state's not giving an incentive. So unless I'm being required to do it by the township or by the state, it's a business at the end of the day, right? So X's and O's, what costs less, what costs more, a robot versus 1,000 sheep, do the math, right? So that's where we are here in Pennsylvania and some of this and other states as well.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there, I know Matt looked at this quite a bit. Michigan State did a pretty in-depth study of what people don't like about grid scale solar when they see it, and driving by, they don't like that look of it. However, when you add agrivoltaics or pollinator, or you do some creative things, I do think it raises the acceptability of the community for that. So we'll see. But to Joe's point, there aren't any direct incentives now. Will there be in the future? Is that a good or bad idea? That's to be determined by policymakers. But I think when you look at the top reasons people are resistant to having it in their neighborhood, it's the view of it that kind of turns people off. But integrating it with production ag, I think, might be a way to make that more palatable.
Thank you. Joe, you want to get the next one?
Sure. Are there any municipalities with zoning to require warehouses be built to structurally support solar panels on the roof?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Not that I've seen, and I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not gonna say whether it is or not, but when I hear that, I think there might be some concerns that it's kind of overstepping the bounds of zoning to require a warehouse to structurally support solar. Generally speaking, from the municipal planning code, it's for the health, safety, and welfare of the community that you can impose restrictions, requirements on structures, buildings, and the like. So, I mean, again, I'm not going to say for sure one way or the other, but it might be a problem of kind of overstepping that. Now, there are maybe things you could do to incentivize warehouse developers to do that. We see with a lot of different zoning and other things, expedited permit reviews, waiving of permitting fees and the like, for doing, certain actions that the community sees as desirable. But requiring it, yeah, I think there is a open question on that of whether you would be able to do that.
Okay. I'll ask the next question because it's my question. So, what that reliability cost component in the electrical cost and the electricity cost in the distribution chart, is that spinning reserve? Is that what that represents?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to there. Is it
In the distribution, there's about 3.5% that was associated with what was called a reliability cost.
okay? Yeah, I'm not sure on the chart. I would think it probably refers to the maintenance of all that. I mean, keeping that
Oh,
running,
okay.
putting that there's a dollar amount in there, obviously, to keep the
Just
grid.
keeping the plants
Yeah,
running.
yeah,
Well,
and even the infrastructure. Yeah.
what about the spinning reserve and what's the role of energy storage at the utility level as far as being able to reduce their overall production costs?
Yeah, I think if you look at the projects being proposed, you're seeing in the renewable, especially the solar, a great increase in projects that have battery storage. And I think if you look at other states, Texas and California, a vast majority of those projects contain the battery storage. Now, the battery storage has gotten a little better. Probably in most utilities' minds, it's a 4 hour reliability, a 4 hour window. There are a lot of claims of 8 hours. I think the magic number really it needs to get to be 10. When you get to 10 hours of storage, then you're basically a player in producing power pretty much 24/7 from
Yeah.
there. And then a lot of the strategy is to take that prime time of the day and power up those batteries. And then when people come home from work and the utilities get a spike, between 5, 6, 7 at night, you can sell that back to the utility at quite a profit, all that battery storage. So I think that's where the attraction comes in. They see that it's a financial win for a lot of the projects. Also, in the PJM, they were exempt from this for a while, but now the larger scale solar projects are part of a must serve clause. If you remember a couple winters ago, we had the big winter storm. We were on the verge of a blackout here in PA, very close to that. And the natural gas suppliers, they had a ton of weather related issues with the extreme cold. They paid billions of dollars in fines because they were not able to produce the power when it was called upon. Solar is now under that same umbrella, so I would think you're going to see even more batteries so that they don't get fined. Because if they obviously get called upon at midnight, you're not going to be producing a lot of solar at midnight. But with the battery storage, they could at least supply some or possibly all of their requirement from the PJM.
Yeah, the battery storage is exploding. It is getting the explosive growth.
Absolutely.
Okay, Joe, you want to get to the next one?
Yep. Delaware approved community solar about a year ago. Do you know if there are any projects in operation?
We're not really like we're like we don't like to go across state lines ever, but I did just look on three different websites, and it looks like from what I can tell, it looks like there must be at least some signups. Delmarva, the Delaware Public Service Commission has application things in effect for interconnection. And then I'm just gonna quote Delmarva and Delaware Public Service Commission because they are reliable sites. There's other ones on here. I just Googled Delaware Community Solar, but I'm not going to give a plug. I'm not going to give a plug for some of these other organizations that, they steal your money tomorrow. You're going to come calling me, right? So I would first start with contacting your provider, your public utility provider as an inquiry to see what they can tell you on that.
Okay. This next question is fairly long. I think, Ron, do you want to just give us your question, unmute, and tell us what you're talking about here?
Hi, hello. Too long to read, eh?
It's
Um,
easier if you could.
sure. So this was about the 110% statement there, and I wasn't sure if it was specific to net metering and the law behind that, but I've been doing this for quite a while, and I have to say that the 110% limitation really never existed in Pennsylvania. I mean, is there 50 kW for residential and 3 megawatts for or non-residential, or up to 5 under special cases. And about several years ago, the PUC came out with a policy statement, which is not a regulation, policy statement saying that there was 110, like a PV capacity couldn't be sized larger than generating 110% more generation over the load over a year's time. But that was only for third party owners, not PPAs or leases. And because it wasn't a regulation, it could really not be enforced. So and then since the more recent Supreme Judge ruling throughout that entire case, the Homerick, all that stuff, that was thrown out as well. So there was never ever a 110% limitation applied here in Pennsylvania. It's been thrown in some bills trying to have a limitation, but it never did get any traction. Just want to point that out.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Joe sometimes talks about the PJM queue. I don't know. I think there, and my understanding was that was part of the kind of workaround. If you didn't exceed that 3 megawatt, you didn't have to get the blessing of the PJM. Is that right, Joe? On the limit?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the 110% thing. I think that was the statement, which sort of looks like this is did you type this or was this an AI thing? But the the 110, I'm not really familiar with that. But yeah, no, the Homrich thing, that's the only thing I'm familiar with the Homrich thing was allowing that retail rate up to 3 megawatts.
Right.
I honestly don't know about the 110%.
Well, let me clarify that a little bit too. I mean, first off, like merchant, I guess, merchant generator actually isn't defined by the PUC or really anywhere, but us in the industry know of it as more an application for solar that generates 100% and back feeds 100% with virtually no load. So that's a pretty much of a distinction versus someone that might be generating, 50% more than they really need. And they get, they get the price to compare value for that excess at the end of the year. But the merchant generator thing has really exploded in the last 2 to 3 years because it's so lucrative. And it was really about you had to have existing load that when the PUC did in fact put out that clarified rulemaking several years ago, it specifically said that you couldn't install or have interconnection of a project on site that had no existing load, which we fought and we lost that battle. But then of course it was reversed, and that's where the Homnick thing comes into play, and he fought that hard, and that's how it was won back.
Okay, Ron, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I don't see any more questions. Do you, Joe?
I do not.
Okay, and it's 8:26, so I think, Phil, do you want to
Yeah.
wrap this up?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for a very informative presentation. We're looking forward. I'm going to have to go through the recording and pick up some additional stuff. You went through so much material there, but really wealth of information. Appreciate your whole panel coming out to share your information with us, and we're excited to learn more about the solar and the situation that we've unfortunately encountering with changes, but we're looking forward to next month when Ron will be taking us through some projects in Philadelphia and bringing us up to speed on some other aspects of solar. So we're looking forward to that presentation. And we thank the Penn State team so much for sharing with us tonight. And we'll look forward to seeing you the last Tuesday in October, October 28th, for our last meeting for this year until January of next year. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And we wish you a good evening.